Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
He has betrayed not only Iran by abusing our commitment to diplomacy, but also deceived his own voters by submitting to the wishes.
Oil prices cut gains as traders bet Iran retaliation won't disrupt supply. Iran orders closure of Strait of Hormuz, putting 1/5 if a world's oil supply at risk. 20% of the world's oil gone overnight. That's what experts say could happen if just one strait, just 21 m wide, is closed from above the Strait of Hormuz. Looks like nothing more than a narrow crack between Iran and Oman, but beneath those waters flows the lifeblood of the global economy, more than a fifth of the world's oil and nearly all of the LNG that powers Asia and Europe. And now that artery is under threat after a wave of Israeli air strikes targeted key Iranian energy sites, including parts of the South Pars gas field. Iran has issued a chilling warning. It may block the strait. Just one underwater mine, one hit on a tanker. That's all it takes. Oil prices, they could double, even triple in a matter of hours. Gasoline, electricity, groceries, everything would spike. Fragile economies like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Lebanon could collapse. And superpowers from Washington to Beijing may be forced into action. This isn't just speculation. It's a war game the Pentagon has rehearsed. A nightmare throne has spent decades preparing for, with suicide boats, anti-ship missiles, and psychological warfare drills. So the question is no longer if but when, and when it happens, who will blink first. Let's break it down right now. All eyes are on June 22nd. 2025, when Iran's parliament move a resolution to close the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for U.S. and Israeli strikes. That decision now awaits approval from Iran's Supreme National Security Council. Here's why that matters. First, the strait handles around 20 million barrels of oil per day, equivalent to roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption. Second, pipelines from Saudi Arabia's east-west line and the UAE's Haben-Fujra route combined can only deliver about 6.5 million barrels per day, leaving a 13.5 million barrel gap. If Hormuz closes, major powers would be forced into action. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is on alert. China and India are stockpiling energy reserves. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are rushing to boost pipeline capacity. Even more alarming, Iran has been running naval drills since early June, deploying mines, missile boats, drone swarms, and fast attack vessels in Hormuz's narrow waters. Antron isn't bluffing. This threat has been baked into their strategic playbook for years. Still, this isn't yet a full blockade. Keeping Hormuz open keeps Iran's own exports moving. Shutting it carries massive risks for Thran too. That's why analysts view the June 22nd vote as a strategic warning, not an imminent shutdown. But even threats can fracture markets. The Pentagon has modeled worst-case scenarios. Energy markets brace for volatility, and every oil tanker passing through Hormuz carries more than crude. It carries the weight of global stability. So when Iran flexes this oil hammer, it's not just saber rattling, it's a calculated strike at the nervous system of the global economy. Next, we dive into the likely chain of reactions from energy markets to military posturing and the high-stakes calculus in Thran, Riyadh, Washington, Beijing, and beyond. So what happens when the Strait of Hormuz becomes a battleground on June 12, 2025, after Israeli airstrikes on Iran's energy infrastructure? Oil markets reacted instantly. Brent crude jumped from $69 to $74 per barrel, marking a 7% surge in just one day. And according to Oxford Economics, if Iran fully blocks the strait, prices could soar to $130 per barrel, dragging down global GDP by 0.8 percentage points. That's not just a market tremor, it's a global shock for countries like Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Egypt, and Pakistan, who import nearly all of their fuel. The effect would be devastating. Foreign reserves would evaporate, local currencies could spiral, and without oil, everything from food to electricity becomes unaffordable almost overnight. In the U.S., a spike of 10 to 12 per barrel often adds 24 to 30 cents per gallon at the pump for the average household. That means hundreds of extra dollars per year just to get to work. But America has some insulation. Asia and Europe don't. Japan and South Korea rely heavily on oil coming through Hormuz. If that flow is cut, inflation rises, interest rates follow, and suddenly even advanced economies are staring at the edge of a recession. Factories slow down, shipping costs explode, supermarkets raise prices, voters grow angry. Iran understands this leverage. That's why it doesn't have to act, just threaten, and still the global market stumbles, because sometimes it's not the missile that causes the damage, it's the silence before the strike. Continuing from a previous section, let's confront the heart of the matter. Will Iran actually act, or is this all strategic posturing? Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz many times in response to sanctions, but it never followed through. The reason is obvious. Thran depends heavily on that same route to export its own oil and gas, but this time things feel different. Following U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iran's energy facilities, in early June 2025, Iranian officials abandoned diplomatic restraint. They labeled the strikes a blow to national survival on June 22. 2025 lawmaker and IRGC commander Esmail Kosari announced that Parliament had voted to close the Strait of Hormuz with final approval pending from Iran's Supreme National Security Council. That isn't idle talk, it's a legislative move. Still, this is not yet full closure. Throne must weigh the economic cost. Without Hormuz, Iran can't export oil or gas. It would cut its own revenues drastically. Instead, the threat serves as strategic leverage. The IRGC has staged naval drills since mid-June, including mine-laying, fast boat exercises, and missile readiness, signaling Tehran isn't bluffing. This show of force is designed to unsettle global energy markets and pressure Washington into de-escalation, and it works. On June 23, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio appealed to Beijing to restrain Iran, warning that closure would be economic suicide for Tehran and provoke military retaliation. In short, Iran is walking a tightrope. It wants the threat to drive up oil prices, rattle global confidence, and buy breathing room, all without actually shutting the strait. But the risk of miscalculation is high. One mine goes and one missile lands off course, and what began as political theater could rapidly escalate into a military showdown. So yes, Iran has the hardware and the political backing. What remains uncertain is whether it dares pull the trigger, and if it does, whether the world will have time to step back before chaos spreads. Picking up from a strategic brink, let's dig into how Iran could actually block Hormuz, and whether the U.S. is ready. Iran has quietly assembled a striking asymmetric arsenal tailored for this exact scenario. It fields fast attack boats, naval mines, anti-ship missiles, kamikaze drones, and many submarines, all optimized for the narrow confines of the strait. It's not speculation. In early 2002 U.S. war planners staged the Millennium Challenge exercise to imagine this very threat under the command of Marine General Paul Van Riper. A red team, mimicking Iran's tactics, used a swarm of explosive boats and cruise missiles. In just 10 minutes, they sank or destroyed 16 U.S. warships, including an aircraft carrier and cruisers. America responded by restricting red team's tactics and rerunning the simulation, and only then did blue forces win. That moment remains a stark warning. Small, cheap vessels can overwhelm advanced fleets today. Iran's capacity has only grown. According to Euronews, in August 2024 alone, the Iranian Navy added 2,640 new missile and drone systems, and even tested cruise missiles launched from subs. Add in dozens of Ghadir-class mini-subs lurking below, each packed with torpedoes, mines, and missiles, and you have a layered hidden threat. On the flip side, the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain has beefed up patrols, mine-clearing ships, and aerial surveillance, yet gray zone tactics, covert mining, surprise drone attacks, fast boat harassment can still force ships to sail slower under more fire. Clearing a mine strait of sophisticated influence mines takes days, possibly weeks. Even with U.S. technology, that means even a brief disruption has an outsized impact. Iran doesn't need to hold Hormuz indefinitely. It just needs to show it can. For now, both sides are locked in a tense chess match. Washington must decide whether it acts preemptively or risks playing catch-up in a strategic bottleneck. That throne knows. By heart, linking back to our question, if Iran actually tries to seal off Hormuz, how will the U.S. respond? The U.S. Fifth Fleet stationed in Bahrain is poised for immediate action. Naval commanders have the authority to launch targeted strikes on Iranian missile sites, radar systems, or vessels that threaten navigation. Americans have a precedent. On April 18, 1988, during Operation Praying Mantis, the U.S. Navy retaliated against Iran's mining of the USS Samuel B. Roberts. In a single day, American forces sank 2 Iranian warships, destroyed 2 surveillance platforms, and damaged others, marking the largest U.S. surface engagement since World War II. Imagine that scenario scaled up. Hormuz blocked mines in the water, Iranian fast attack boats, and anti-ship missiles in play. The Fifth Fleet wouldn't hesitate to counter. Backed by British, French, and Gulf allies, they'd likely execute a swift campaign of strikes to reopen the strait under international law. But this isn't limited to conventional warfare. Under NATO's Article 5, if a NATO vessel is struck during crisis operations, an attack on one becomes an attack against all. The result would be a full-blown allied military response, possibly escalating into broader operations. Still, the timing would be tight. Clearing mines and defensive zones in Hormuz can take days or longer, and during that window, oil markets would skyrocket and civilian shipping would retreat to costly alternative routes. Even limited military action would ripple through global trade and energy prices. In short, if Iran makes good on its threat, Washington already has a blueprint from 1988. The question isn't whether the U.S. can respond, it's whether Iran can block the Strait long enough to force that choice. And if they try, the U.S. may find itself racing against time in one of the world's most critical choke points, linking from a fallout on U.S. options. Let's turn south and east. Will China and Russia leap into the Hormuz crisis or stay on the sidelines? China has a clear stake in this. More than 70% of its oil imports come from the Middle East, mainly through the Strait of Hormuz and the South China Sea. That dependency isn't shifting fast because Beijing still lacks major overland alternatives in scale. Even with pipelines from Central Asia and Myanmar ramping up, tankers through Hormuz remain critical. As tensions escalated, China's foreign ministry issued a rare public warning cautioning that any disruption in the region could jeopardize global energy security. Behind the scenes, however, Beijing is already preparing with a naval base in Djibouti active since 2017. The Chinese Navy has the reach to send escort vessels into the Gulf, aiming to protect what officials call their energy lifelines. Here's the catch: a Chinese naval presence alongside U.S. and British fleets risks direct confrontation. Washington already patrols the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and has legal authority under international law to keep Hormuz open. Face standoffs between carrier groups are no longer a Cold War fantasy. They're a real possibility if China pushes its escort agenda amid the crisis. Meanwhile, Russia plays a subtler hand. Moscow benefits from rising oil prices thanks to its role as a major exporter. Putin has already signaled that OPEC Plus need not intervene if prices climb from a Middle East tension. Russia also wields leverage at the United Nations. On June 23, Moscow supported China and Pakistan in calling for a Security Council ceasefire resolution, blanking any U.S. moves to condemn Iran. There's more. Iran's supreme leader asked President Putin to deepen ties after the June strikes. A sign Russia is being courted for political cover, whether that's vetoing sanctions at the UN or quietly supplying Tehran with air defense and missile tech. Russia can extend the drama without firing a shot if China sends warships to guard oil traffic and Russia backs Iran diplomatically or militarily. You get a three-way chessboard. The U.S. would face a choice: back off or risk broader confrontation. NATO might be dragged in if a non-U.S. ally is attacked, but none of this points to open war. China still prefers non-inference public posture, and Russia must juggle its Ukraine campaign and relations with the West. That leaves Iran in a strong position, armed with asymmetric and nuclear leverage, economically fatigued, but privately backed and diplomatically shielded, at least temporarily, by stronger powers. Yet the regional chessboard remains fragile. If China physically escorts tankers, the U.S. may have to either let it pass or risk a naval incident. If Russia delivers arms to Iran or vetoes UN sanctions, Washington's diplomatic options shrink. Energy markets already reflect this tension. Brent crude climbed to $80 per barrel on June 22nd. After Iran's parliament vote that move alone threatened over $1 billion in daily oil exports passing through Hormuz. In ordinary times, global powers avoid direct confrontation, but in this tight choke point, a single misjudgment triggers cascade effects. Oil prices spike, shipping halts, local economies break, then military deployments escalate, then political leaders face public pressure as inflation hits home from gas pumps to grocery aisles. In that atmosphere, China's dispatch of warships could be framed as defensive energy protection. Russia's assistance might stay behind closed doors, but if either side crosses the line, the Hormuz crisis transforms from a regional showdown to a global clash. So will China and Russia stand aside or step in? For now, they talk of diplomacy and restraint, yet their moves suggest a coordinated strategy: deter the U.S., support Iran's leverage, and keep Western focus divided. It's a geopolitical tightrope, and one misstep could topple the fragile balance in Hormuz and the world building from the U.S. military's steepening response. Let's explore the potential for Israel and new flashpoints emerging alongside the Hormuz crisis, and how those could stretch American attention. Tensions on multiple fronts are already intensifying. If the U.S. diverts naval power from the Pacific to the Persian Gulf, China might seize the moment, stepping up pressure over Taiwan. Meanwhile, North Korea could ramp up provocations along the Korean peninsula to test Washington's focus. Even more regional instability in an already combustible environment. Iran, however, has its own network of allies ready to ride the wave. Hezbollah in Lebanon is armed with roughly 150,000 rockets and missiles. That stockpile has grown more than tenfold since 2006. It now poses a direct threat to Israel with its capacity for sustained barrage. Just as concerning, Houthi rebels in Yemen have repeatedly struck vessels in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, potentially signaling a shift to maritime disruption if Iran signals to open new theaters. Iranian-backed groups are also prepared for asymmetrical warfare. They've demonstrated coordinated cyber attacks and terrorist operations in Gulf states, and if Hamas remains embroiled, these proxies could escalate simultaneously. Iran's strategy appears clear: create multiple pressure points, forcing the U.S. to either stretch resources thin or accept concessions. The risk is that America becomes entangled in what one analyst recently described as a global choke-point crisis instead of focused diplomacy or targeted military action in the Gulf. Washington might confront a coalition of destabilizing events: Iranian proxy strikes, Chinese naval maneuvers, North Korean missile tests, and healthy disruptions for the U.S. That means redeploying military assets across vast distance and complexity. Carrier strike groups take days to reposition bases in Korea, Japan, and the Gulf must shuffle aircraft, missiles, and personnel. And politically, the Biden administration, or its successor, must justify global entanglement on two fronts amid war fatigue. Domestically, Americans would see higher gas prices, higher shipping costs, growing inflation, and potentially injured citizens abroad. That leads to pressure on Congress to avoid expensive entanglements. In turn, adversaries perceive hesitation if the U.S. is unwilling to engage multiple theaters simultaneously. Tehran and other actors might ramp up operations. Confident in a limited response, history offers a cautionary parallel following World War II. No U.S. administration faced simultaneous global hotspots at this scale. The Cold War spread stress across Europe and Asia, but the Persian Gulf remained mostly separate. Now the Gulf could become the centerpiece of a multi-front geopolitical showdown, and the U.S. may lack the bandwidth to manage every flare-up. What starts as an Iranian threat to shut Hormuz could thus spiral. One moment, a Chinese escort ship bumps a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf. Next, Hezbollah fires a precision missile into Israel. North Korea tests another bomb-capable missile. Yemen-based drones hit Red Sea shipping lanes. Suddenly, the world faces concurrent security crisis, not isolated conflicts. That's Iran's angle. Use the Strait as a trigger to ignite a broader geopolitical puzzle, and then watch as Washington scrambles to respond on multiple fronts, teetering between containment and overreach. The clock is ticking, and the more actors tee themselves up to act, the more urgent it becomes, because in a world of overlapping crises, the toughest question isn't if the U.S. can respond, it's whether it can respond in time and without triggering a global escalation. One straight 20% of the world's oil, and just one wrong move could spark a global meltdown. Hormuz isn't just a waterway, it's a trigger point, a single choke point where military strategy, energy security, and geopolitical ambition collide. We've seen Iran threaten it before, but this time the warning comes with missiles in the sky, drones in the water, and a vote in Parliament. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is already on alert. China is watching. So is Russia. So is the world. If Iran seals off Hormuz, America will respond, likely with force. But what happens if that spirals into a wider war? What if NATO gets pulled in? And what if the U.S. has to pull resources from the Pacific? Would Beijing use that moment to move on? Taiwan's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un bluntly stated on June 18, 2025, that any U.S. military strike would cause irreparable consequences. That isn't rhetorical flair. It's a clear signal of Iran's readiness to escalate. So the real question is, do you think Iran will actually block Hormuz? And if they do, who strikes first, the U.S., Israel, or someone we're not watching yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this crisis may be closer than anyone's ready for.